In this video, I want to talk about what I believe is the biggest problem facing the Catholic Church as it stands right now. Definitely want to hear you guys' opinions and thoughts on this because I'd like this to be a discussion if possible. I'll also talk about why we should be really focused in on this, why I think we should put all our efforts into this matter, and then what are some action steps we can do. What I ultimately believe is the biggest problem facing the Catholic Church is that Catholics simply just don't care, or they're apathetic, but ultimately they just don't care. And when I say don't care, this is in a number of different areas, and this may seem like an obvious statement because people might say, well, obviously we're seeing a problem that Catholics aren't caring. But what I'm talking about really when I say this is I'm gearing towards the Catholics that are maybe they're self-proclaimed Catholics. They really feel deeply about the faith. They're even going to mass every Sunday and stuff like that. But when you start getting into some of the core tenets of the faith and you just start talking about it, and even to those people who, again, are self-proclaimed Catholics, maybe are not going to mass, people that are from this younger generation, I find this, but even the older generation, when you start discussing some of these important things about the faith, they kind of just shrug their shoulders at you. Maybe you plant a seed and maybe they start thinking about it for like a second or two, but ultimately they kind of shrug their shoulders and like, yeah, I don't know. I can see what you mean, but I'm not really too worried about it. They have this very, very easy, kind of almost a Protestant view of Catholicism, which is as long as I believe in God, I'm pretty much okay. Everything else that the Catholic Church says is either they don't know about it, there's some ignorance for sure, which is an element to this, but they're not too worried about it. They don't think it's really that important. And again, they simply just don't care. I find that they ultimately don't care about the sacraments. They seem to not care or even know about saying receiving communion in a state of grace. They don't seem to care about the sacrament of confession other than like, yeah, it seems like a good thing to do once in a while, maybe like once a year, once every few years. Maybe they don't necessarily care about defending or even knowing what the purpose of marriage is. They don't seem to care about reverence. I had a conversation with somebody recently about, the not trying to be holier than thou, but talking about why, reverence was important when you're comparing like things like comparing the traditional Latin Mass and Novus Ordo Mass. I wasn't trying to knock the Novus Ordo Mass. I was just talking about some differences. And they said, well, isn't there more to Mass than just the Eucharist and just receiving communion? And I said, well, really, that's the sum of our faith, as it says in the Catechism. There's other things I got into, but point is, people don't seem to care about that part of it. They don't seem to care about the commandments, looking more into the commandments. They don't seem to care or know about moral law. And ultimately, there's just really no backbone to the faith. And so why this ultimately matters and why I think this is the most important thing is because, yes, we can say, well, let's just focus on our own interior life and hopefully it will kind of spread out to those around us. And yes, that's a good thing. But if we don't actively take part in the Catholic apathy that's going on right now, it affects all of us. And it's only going to make our own interior spiritual life much more difficult. It's going to affect our children growing in the faith. Even if you don't have children, it's going to affect the future generation, which I would argue is what got us into this problem. And one of the reasons that got us into this problem, I can talk my own example. I know this. I'm not in a minority here, but my own example coming up in the faith, going into Mass, pretty much every Sunday, was even if I read a catechism or went through catechesis, I honestly don't remember any of it. Even if I learned some basic tenets of the faith, that ultimately is not what shaped my faith or my knowledge of the Catholic faith. It was the environment around me. It was my parish life around me. It was how I saw my parents kind of live out the faith, not directly kind of knocking them, but it was the environment is my point. So how it was supposed to work, and we know this is how it's supposed to work, was 100 years ago, or not even going back further than that, our towns and villages were focused on the church was everything. That was the center focal point of our life. And that spread throughout our communities. At the very least, it was present in our families. And we grew to know the faith, not ultimately through our books and our catechesis, but we learned that ultimately through our environment. We learned about the Catholic faith through the actions from our family and hopefully from our parish life. And that has essentially been decimated. It decimated our schools. It's decimated our parish life, in my opinion, where if you look at what parish life is kind of considered now, it's more like a social gathering club where we talk about kind of nice things and how to grow in our faith. Little is known about our own just understanding and learning more about our own catechism and understanding how to live that out. And this is kind of hard to say who's at fault for this. It's like one of those chicken or the egg problems. Is it the priest's fault in the church hierarchy? Can we blame them? Certainly there's some blame to them, but ultimately, or is it the culture? Because if the culture has ultimately shaped if we sum up the majority of Catholic beliefs and say what percentage of Catholics believe this, you guys know this is probably a conservative estimate. We take everything in kind of summation. We got like maybe 70+% of Catholics do not believe some basic tenets of the faith, or they don't even know about them. So if you have the majority of your parish who already is suffering to get people coming into the doors, and they don't believe more than half the stuff you're teaching, are you going to be teaching about those particular issues to drive more people out? And or are the priests, just simply have their hands tied behind their back from church hierarchy, maybe making these decisions, or they feel like they can't say these things without being reprimanded from their parish councils and stuff like that. So ultimately, my point is this lack of knowledge and lack of not caring ultimately is going to affect us as much as you think it's someone else's problem, and that this is just a cancer that continues to grow in our community, and it just makes our job as being a practicing Catholic all the more difficult. So my point is, don't just let it fall to the wayside and feel like, well, okay, I'll just focus on myself. I'll worry about them later. Hopefully they get it, and it'll work itself out. Ultimately, this is just leading down to a very watered down faith that is simply just relative. Because even if it doesn't affect you, the world from the outside, people that are non-Catholics, maybe looking at the faith or judging the faith through another Catholic's lens, odds are their interpretation of what Catholicism is vastly different to what it's supposed to be, because they're going off of what the majority is essentially doing. And I know that when I've heard people say things, what they think the Catholic Church is standing for when it comes to like certain social issues and what's going on in the culture now, the way they see the Catholic Church to what it really essentially is teaching is vastly different. And the odd thing is I mentioned this in the previous video when I talked about canceled Catholics, that the people who actually do care, you guys who I assume listening to this video, are directly and indirectly labeled as weird. Excuse me. You're called examples like you're a Pharisee. You're being too scrupulous, which, yes, you can be too scrupulous, but they forget the fact that Jesus was a practicing Jew, that he did not throw away the commandments. Yes, he fulfilled the law, but Jesus himself was someone who kept the law and was devout in his practices. So this idea that people look at you, again, you're someone who's just living it out, they think you're the weird one. That again just shows how far removed we are. So what we can ultimately do about it, and again, I want to hear what you guys have to say about it, is we have to get active. Yes, you have to live it out, and living it out is going to be harder than ever, as I already kind of previously set that up, just because we're fighting an uphill battle. I know people who are in certain parishes who feel like they're like they're by themselves in their own faith. They're in a different religion and they're trying to stick it out. And it's getting harder and harder because you have good, well-meaning people who are maybe converting to things like Orthodoxy, or worst case, are just simply leaving the faith because they feel like, well, what's the point? I'm the only one here. We have to get out. We have to evangelize. And by doing it, there are effective ways of doing that. Yes, living it out. Yes, continually talking about it, inviting your family members and friends to certain groups. I think small groups are one of the best things you can do. I know it's hard sometimes to start a small group in certain parishes because it has to get kind of okayed by their director of education. There's so many ways nowadays to start a small group. Sometimes you can inadvertently get into a small group by using another organization, something like if you're in a Knights of Columbus, Legion of Mary, something like that. And generally those are well-meaning Catholics. And if you just say, hey, I want to start we're going to do a small group, a virtual small group or in-person small group we'll do a Bible study program. We'll read a book and we'll talk about that for an hour. That I think is one of the most effective ways to, one, meet like-minded people, but then slowly introduce some people into that circle. I could make a whole other video talking about small groups because I think there's a good and bad way of doing it, because sometimes small groups can actually drive people away. So I'm trying to find ways that are making it as easy and approachable, and make it also that people have a voice in their small group is very important. But my point is, you have to be active. The two active steps I would say is, yes, living it out, but my second action step would be getting involved in small groups in your parishes as much as possible, and really trying to avoid, which this happens often, is these small groups are just little, which is still a good thing. Don't get me wrong. This is still very important. They're generally just bonds of people with the same like-minded ideas, and that's good. But we need to get the people that are on the fence, not necessarily knowing what these things, getting those people involved as well. And then three is say if you have a family, whether that's you have kids or not, or maybe it's you and a spouse, or maybe it's just you living with your parents, right away we have to focus on the family. We have to focus on living this out daily, whether that's morning prayers, evening prayers, whatever you're doing now. Up it up slowly to a certain degree, and start to put the faith at a center of your family life as much as possible. Because if we don't, it's gone. And I know that's what I'm saying. We're working extra hard now because we've let it got so out of hand, and unfortunately we're fighting an uphill battle that is, we just have to recognize it's going to be hard. It's not as easy as it used to be. It's not as natural as it used to be. It required no effort in the past. I shouldn't say no effort, but when I talked to like my parents and what their life was like, every house was Catholic. Every house was doing this naturally. It wasn't a weird thing to do this because everyone was saying daily rosaries. People were going to daily mass. It was very easy because everyone was doing it. It was a part of your life. Nowadays, like I said, it's labeled as weird. It's culturally different. If we want to turn this around, we have to start at the family level. So small groups, evangelizing for sure, living it out, but then starting with whatever kind of unit you're around. If you have no unit, find one, whether that's some community you're a part of, whatever that is, you're part of some sort of club. Try and find like-minded people and then kind of spread that out. But definitely, start with yourself, evangelize, do a small group. And that's, I think, are the biggest things we can kind of do to combat this. If you guys have any questions or comments about this, definitely let me know. I want to hear what you guys have to say about it, but thank you for watching.